And I think we have to ask, do today's Marxist activists have any reason to say that they hate above anyone else in the world the church leaders most celebrated by our cultural elites? Or do they find that their efforts are not only not hampered by Christian cultural elites, but are in fact helped by them?
Megan Basham of the Daily Wire, speaking at the 2026 Issues Etc. Making the Case conference.
We must resist the infiltrators and use our power in such a way that when those who oppose the cause of Christ are asked who they hate most in the world, they think of our names.
You can watch Megan Basham making the case against progressive influence in the church from this year's Making the Case conference. For a contribution of $250 by Labor Day, we'll send you a link to watch the entire conference. Learn more at issuesetc.org.
I think the fate of Christianity in Europe should be very, very sobering for Christians in America and make them realize that nothing can be taken for granted at this point.
What you actually can affirm for your child is you are baptized. You don't need to be defined by this gender dysphoria that's nagging at you and trying to get you to carve up your body and make all these changes. You are actually defined by what God says.
Union with the flesh of Jesus. There is nothing greater than that. And American evangelicalism cannot say that. It's a disembodied Christ. There's no Jesus in the water, Jesus in the Word, Jesus in your ear, Jesus in your mouth.
All of the Lutherans from the very beginning to the very end teach not only that good works are to be done, but even the necessity of good works.
Grocery clerks in Tennessee love listening to Issues Etc.
The process of becoming Prime Minister of Great Britain is not complicated. You are elected, then you go and visit with the monarch, in this case, King Charles III. He will formally ask you to form a government, and then you are on your way. Andy Burnham has done those things. He is the 7th Prime Minister in a decade of Great Britain. He's also, some saying, a practicing Catholic. Now, is he practicing or is he a cultural Catholic? It's quite difficult to tell sometimes. Greetings and welcome to Issues Etc. live on this Wednesday afternoon, July the 22nd. I'm Todd Wilkin. Thanks for tuning us in. We'll be talking about media coverage of Britain's first openly Catholic Prime Minister with Terry Mattingly. We'll spend some time with Peter Northcott of National Right to Life, talking about abortion ballot initiatives in Idaho, Virginia, Nevada, and Missouri. Then Pastor Will Whedon will join us for a conversation on the Lord's Prayer in Lutheran worship. Terry Mattingly is Senior Fellow on Communications and Culture at St. Constantine College in Houston, Texas. He writes Rational Sheep, a Substack newsletter on faith, family, and mass media. He's author of the National On Religion column for the Andrews McMeel Universal Syndicate, and for 2 decades, he led the GetReligion.org website. Terry, welcome back.
Glad to be here.
So what kind of Catholic is the new British Prime Minister?
Well, as always, that's an interesting question. In this case, we have a man who has been so candid in the past about the fact that he is merely a cultural Catholic that the press coverage is not having any trouble getting around what normally is the big issue, which is, can you call him a devout Catholic? Can you call him a practicing Catholic? And in this case, the press doesn't need to wrestle with this at all, because he has made it quite clear that the accurate word to include here is cultural. He is a cultural Catholic. The press coverage of his appointment on this issue is actually quite strong. And my favorite part of it is in the New York Times piece. You get a quote, which I saw in several other places. In a 2009 interview with The Guardian, Mr. Burnham said, "3 things are important in my life apart from my family. Everton FC, which is a football team, a soccer team, the Labour Party, and the Catholic Church in that order." Everton, which is based in Liverpool, is the soccer club he's long supported. The reason I say that is it all comes back to cultural identity. Another couple of sentences later, He likened his religious identity to following a soccer club without regularly going to its matches at the stadium. You're still an Evertonian. You can stop going to the church, but you're still a Catholic. But he also said that his religious upbringing had shaped his political views. I was brought up in the belief in Catholic social teaching, and that was hugely formative. As I saw it, the closest thing to what I was told there was labor politics. So he draws a direct connection between the parts of Catholic teaching that he embraces and his identity in the Labor Party. Now, if you live here in America, you've heard Democrats make that kind of statement, for many years. But what I think is fascinating, normally when you and I talk about this issue with public identity of Catholicism in American politics, we're dealing with situations where Democratic politicians, if anything, flaunt their Catholic identity and sort of their practice. I mean, the Joe Biden thing of walking around with a rosary in his pocket and showing up for worship whenever possible, and frankly also testing at certain times whether the priest would be willing to give him communion. Same thing for some other liberal Catholics. So I think you could make a case that in Burnham's life, if anything, he might be hiding the fact that he still goes to church or practices his faith in any way, because it would probably be more controversial in this era in British life if he did practice a strong form of Christian faith than if he didn't have one. So photographers may have a different reason to follow him around on Sunday morning or something like that to see if he sneaks off to Mass, whereas Biden did everything but hold a parade for photographers. So he is a cultural Catholic.
I simply, just to extend that contrast a little bit here, Terry, I can't imagine any national level Catholic politician of the political ilk of Nancy Pelosi or Joe Biden or others saying, well, I'm this first and a Catholic second. They are, in fact, everyone can see it and realize it, except their parish priest, apparently. But I can't imagine them actually saying that. That seems a big difference.
Well, it's very radically different contexts. But at the same time, I think this is a man who has been candid long enough about this issue that not only does he not have any road back from that, but the press doesn't either. I kept looking for some sort of identification for his level of practice or something, and the press at this point, and this isn't to their credit, they're just quoting the man, and the man is making himself very clear. Now, I think it's also clear from talking, from his words, that he's going to play the Pope Francis card as much as possible. In fact, that right in between those two references to football in the New York Times piece, there is this interesting interjection right in that context. After meeting Pope Francis at the Vatican with other regional leaders in 2023, Mr. Burnham told another British newspaper, The Telegraph, "Even though I'm not a Catholic in that full sense of the word, I felt the magnetic pull of the Vatican." So I think you might see this man declare himself a Pope Francis Catholic as one way around it. But my major thing I want our listeners to think about, especially those who are as old as I am, the more appropriate thing you can ask, you could say he's going to attempt to be a Governor Mario Cuomo Catholic. And I make that for a very specific reason. American politics of Catholics and politics changed in 1984 when the late Governor Mario Cuomo of New York delivered an address at Notre Dame called Religious Belief and Public Morality. And this was the speech in which what some people would say, someone like John F. Kennedy, practice, this is when Cuomo just came right out and said it. And basically, he laid out the groundwork for the Catholic position of almost all, I mean, we've pretty much killed off the pro-life Democrats in American politics now. But what these people will all say is, I may be personally opposed to abortion, as in the teachings of my church, but I am going to publicly back the views of my constituents and thus become XYZ to whatever degree they're going to openly state that they are pro-abortion rights, all the way down to sponsoring legislation that directly conflicts with the teachings of the church. Now, jumping ahead here in my outline for today, what I think is going to be fascinating, that personally opposed but formula has dominated American Catholic politics for decades now. I think before I go and say that Burnham is going to be a Mario Cuomo Catholic, I think you could make a case, based on his statements, that he's not even going to be willing to be a Mario Cuomo Catholic and say he's personally opposed to some of the sexual revolution teachings of the Catholic Catechism. He's going to just openly come out and say, no, I disagree with my church on those issues, and I have no intention of claiming otherwise. And he might say, under Vatican II, that's a matter of my own conscience, and I'm going to leave it at that. So we're going to see how candid he is. But so far, I don't think he's got any ability to retreat towards some sort of acknowledgement of Catholic doctrine on most of these issues. Although, of course, he's going to say that Catholic moral teachings influence his thoughts on immigration, on poverty, on public health care, and a bunch of other things. But then, unless Pope Leo really calls his hand on it, he's not going to note that the same Catholic teachings on the sacredness of the human being and the degree that human life is a sacred thing from conception until natural death, he's not going to notice that the church pulls its stances on immigration, and of course there are a lot of arguments about that, immigration, poverty, death penalty, etc., from the same basic Catholic doctrine in Catholic moral teachings, social teachings, from which they get their stance on abortion. We'll have to see how he handles that. I don't think he's even going to play the personally opposed but card, which makes him an entire new generation of Catholic politician. And like you just said, I think it would be hard to see an American Catholic who is going to church at least some of the time and has pictures of Ash Wednesday ashes on their forehead. It's hard to see them saying what he said about my faith is 2 steps lower than my football allegiance. But I think most American Catholics are still Mario Cuomo Catholics. I think this guy's going to go further than that.
Terry Mattingly is our guest. We're talking about media coverage of Britain's first Catholic Prime Minister. On the other side, we'll get into some of the coverage.
We're going to have to be vigilant on 2 different fronts. We're going to have to defend the truth, about the human person, made in the image and likeness of God, created male and female, created for marriage. We're also going to have to defend our freedom to live according to those truths.
Dr. Ryan Anderson, president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center and member of the White House Religious Liberty Commission, speaking at this year's Issues Etc. Making the Case conference.
Over and over again, we're going to see that we have to form the next generation of our students, of our children, our grandchildren to believe the truth, while also defending our freedom to live it out. And then the long game is reforming our civil laws to reflect the truth.
You can watch Ryan Anderson's presentation, Making the Case for Social Conservatism, from the 2026 Issues Etc. Making the Case conference. For a donation of $250 by Labor Day, we'll send you a link to watch an on-demand video stream and download audio recordings. Order online at issuesetc.org.
Solid, serious, substantive. You're listening to Issues Etc.
Criticism.
Thank God that it's 5:01 and the show is over.
Commendation.
I am not a Lutheran, but I regularly listen to Issues Etc. and thank you for putting this on the air.
Conundrum.
A Catholic friend has come to our LCMS church, and he said, "Why do you say very God, a very God?" And I couldn't think of a good answer.
The Issues Etc. comment line, 618-223-8382.
Hearing is taken for granted until you don't have it. It happens at all ages. Unfortunately, some are born deaf. Others lose it gradually. The end is the same, a world of silence. The Ephatha Lutheran Mission Society serves the deaf and hard of hearing domestically and internationally. They're the only recognized service organization in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod devoted solely to the deaf of all ages. Learn more at elms-deaf.org.
Welcome back to Issues Etc. I'm Todd Wilkin. We're talking about media coverage of Britain's first openly Catholic Prime Minister. Terry Mattingly is our guest. He is author of the National On Religion column for the Andrews McMeel Universal Syndicate. So, Terry, where would you go first to comment on some of the media coverage of this?
Well, it's positive, but I would argue that it's pretty thorough. I've already said the New York Times piece, of course, is where a lot of people are going to start. And I think that and the Religion News Service piece, which will not run in many papers, but I still think if people wanted to look it up, that's one place to go. The AP radio feature that I ran into featured some very wise quotes from a good source, Ruth Gledhill, who for years was the editor for The Times in UK, the religion editor, and she's now at an internationally known Catholic newspaper called The Tablet. And she sums him up by saying, he's the first who's baptized a Catholic. He was an altar boy, grew up in the Catholic Church, but I wouldn't say he's necessarily a regular Mass-going Catholic now. Some people might describe him as more of a Catholic, a cultural Catholic, and certainly in some aspects of the church teachings. I know there are some Catholics that would find him in opposition to the church. Now, one of the main things that the Religion News Service piece does well is places his appointment in a more of a historical context. And, for example, noting that he's the first who is a Catholic publicly at the time he becomes prime minister. And, of course, they're stressing the difference between him and Tony Blair, who converted to Roman Catholicism, which was the faith of his wife and children, but he did that after he left office. Boris Johnson was baptized a Catholic, but had left the church for the Church of England before he ever became prime minister. So you have some kind of flirting with the danger zone of Roman Catholicism in previous politicians, and of course, Tony Blair would also be on anyone's short list of kind of a hero of the center left, and certainly has, I would say, now that I think about it, I think Tony Blair would say he's a personally opposed butt Catholic when it comes to some of the more controversial social issues. It'd be very interesting to see if he would say that on same-sex marriage. But Burnham, like I said, is another step beyond that. So I would recommend the Religion News Service piece for anyone who wants to know why this is news just at the level of government. And everybody is saying that even though the prime minister is supposed to be consulted on major appointments, such as who is named to the archbishop roles, Archbishop of Canterbury in particular, they're saying that there might be a show of finding an arrangement where Burnham, as a Catholic, does not play any role in naming leaders of the Church of England. So we can watch for that, but at this point, I don't think anyone seriously thinks the Prime Minister is influencing who gets appointed to those positions.
Does this seem to be an issue of note in the British press, the fact that he's Catholic, or do they simply see this as the peaceful transfer of power from one very fraught prime minister to another?
Well, I didn't dig into the British coverage, but if you look at his career, I just think it's a part of who he is. But certain aspects of the British press, especially the Times, really likes to dwell on the mechanics of the Church of England. And so I would say that when, let's say, the first issue comes up where Burnham is asked to take a stand that is going to publicly clash with the stance of the Roman Catholic hierarchy, both in the UK and, of course, more importantly, in Rome, yet he is taking a stance where he's going to be standing side by side with the Archbishop of Canterbury. I think at that point you can expect the British press to light up fireworks over this situation and talk about what a unique situation this is, that you have a man who's publicly identified as a Catholic, but he's now openly supporting the position of the Church of England. And we can already know, just by reading between the lines in the coverage, I think we can already know what that issue will be, and that is assisted dying, euthanasia. Because, let me read a section of the Religion News Service part. Burnham has indicated he has difficulties with some aspects of Catholic teaching, particularly personal sexual morality. In 2015, in an interview with Premier Christian News, he said he had issues with its teaching on contraception and homosexuality, describing it as developing a more judgmental mode under Pope Benedict XVI. But he went on to say that, quote, Catholic social teaching underpins my politics. There's that Catholic social teaching distinction, where apparently Catholic social teaching is really important when it's about economics and foreign policy maybe, but the same social teachings in the Catechism don't get connected to right-to-life issues, for example. That brings us to the next sentence. Catholic leaders will no doubt watch how the new prime minister might deal with contentious issues such as assisted dying, considered anathema to the Catholic Church, or funding for faith schools. I think right now you can say that the next time there's a debate in Parliament about euthanasia, assisted dying, whatever the phrase will be, it's going to be interesting to see whether he takes a public stand on the issue, or maybe he just looks at Parliament and says, "Thy will be done."
The head of the Catholic Church in England and Wales is the Archbishop of Westminster. That's Archbishop Richard Moth. Does he need to get a phone call sometime?
Well, he talked to the BBC, and he said that being a Catholic and Christian, as Burnham is, informs conscience the way you think about things, unquote. And playing right along, the Archbishop of Westminster comes right out and says, I hope we see real concern for humanity, not just on the grand scale, but for the needs of families and the homeless. Now, in his first speech as Prime Minister, standing out in front of 10 Downing, he made a very strong appeal. I promise to try to end, and interesting phrase, rough sleeping in our country, which is apparently British code for the homeless sleeping on streets. So it's possible we'll see strong shows of support from Catholic leaders when he speaks out on that kind of thing. Then we'll watch how publicly they go when he takes stands that conflict with the other side of their doctrine. And I'm going to go ahead and call it here. I think assisted dying is the issue to keep your eye on.
Terry Mattingly is our guest. We're talking about media coverage of Britain's first Catholic Prime Minister. Can this expand into a story about the state of Catholicism in Great Britain?
The church's music from the 2nd century.
Shepherd of tender youth, guiding in love and truth.
The 6th century. The 12th century. The 16th century. The 21st century. The best of the church's music from the past 2,000 years. LutheranPublicRadio.org.
Listen to what you want, when you want. You're listening to Issues, Etc.
Here's an easy way for you to help us contend for truth in an age of anti-truth. Subscribe to the Issues, Etc. podcast with YouTube, Spotify, and Apple. Just type Issues, Etc. in the YouTube search engine and click subscribe. For Apple and Spotify, type Issues, Etc. in the search engine, hit follow, and leave us a 5-star review. Help us inform other podcast listeners by subscribing to the Issues, Etc. podcast with YouTube, Spotify, and Apple.
Unity and variety can be a hot topic among Christians and Lutherans in particular, and the June-July issue of the Lutheran Witness takes this topic up with articles such as Unity and Variety Through the Ages by Richard Serena, Formed Together by Sean Dinzer, A Call to Faithful and Harmonious Variety in Worship, and much more. To get your copy, visit cph.org/witness or visit witness.lcms.org to learn more. The Lutheran Witness, helping you interpret the world from a Lutheran perspective.
Welcome back to Issues, Etc. I'm Todd Wilkin. Terry Mattingly is our guest as we look at media coverage of Britain's first openly Catholic Prime Minister. In about 10 minutes, we'll spend some time with Peter Northcott, Director of State Strategies for National Right to Life, talking about abortion ballot initiatives in Idaho, Virginia, Nevada, and Missouri. Terry, we know a lot, and there's a lot to be found about the state of the faith, so to speak, in the Church of England. It's a pretty dire picture there. But is this an opportunity to look into the lesser-known story about the state of Catholicism in Great Britain?
Well, it is, and it's timely in that we're right at the stage where most folks who do demographics would argue that there are more Catholics in church during a typical week than in England than there are now in the Church of England. Anglicans attending worship services in the Church of England. And that opens up a lot of different doors, one of which is that the irony is, we do have some coverage of young Anglicans being interested in traditional worship, et cetera, and we have some coverage of the young Catholics in England being interested in the Latin Mass. So you have that subject. So you could you could say it's an appropriate time to look at the next generation in both of those churches. But quite frankly, a lot of the momentum the Catholic Church has had in Britain in the last decade or two seems to have be slacking off. And among Anglicans, everything I've read is that if there are growing, active Anglican churches, and there are some in England, they tend to primarily be Protestant. They tend to be much more openly, black cassock, low church Anglicans, to put it in that sense. In other words, you go to worship there, and it's probably more like Protestant charismatic worship with worship bands, hands in the air, etc. It's a more overtly evangelical charismatic form of faith. I'd love to see additional surveys on that, but the last time I dug into that, it seemed to me that the action in Catholicism was in more conservative parishes, and the action within Anglicanism was in more evangelical Protestant churches.
Another prospect here, now that he has taken a residence at 10 Downing Street, if he manages to hold the post, which is a big question because a lot of churn in that particular place, he might likely cross paths with Pope Leo, and very interesting, a Catholic Prime Minister of Great Britain and an American Pope.
Well, like I said earlier, at what point will the Pope do something other than congratulate him? And this Pope has a very positive, affirming style without some of the bite and contention that we tended to see with Pope Francis. But once again, I think immigration is the hot issue in England right now. You have people saying that the grooming gang scandals and things like that have England poised on the edge of a knife in terms of turning into some sort of serious conflict between trendy, urban England and your more conservative, so to speak, red zone, to put it in American terms, smaller cities, small towns, rural England, which tends to be more conservative, especially on the billions of pounds being poured into support for immigration in their country. Now, I should note that Burnham, back earlier in his career, has played some role. When he was the Greater Manchester mayor, he commissioned local reviews into failings on some of the rape gang grooming situation. He even issued, it's amazing that this is controversial in England, he actually issued apologies to victims, which that's conservative now. But he was still attacked by the right for not doing enough. So what will the Pope be willing to say about some of the darker sides of the immigration story in the United Kingdom? And specifically, we could see violence. We could say that potential violence in the streets could turn into a crisis for this prime minister. And if that's the case, it'd be interesting to see what Pope Leo would have to say on that. As always, I expect him to be very low-key and judicious on that.
Do you think there's a U.S. connection here, given that the news media has frequently referred to President Biden as a devout Catholic? Do you think the question of his devotion is likely to come up?
I don't think they want to talk about Biden for any reason whatsoever right now, as the video clips of him continue to come out. But I will say this, because it's a good chance to illustrate a point I made earlier. Biden, when we were talking about the Cuomo era of I'm personally opposed to same-sex marriage, but I'm going to support my constituents in New York or Delaware or whatever who are in favor of this change in our culture. And even though I have personal beliefs as a Catholic, I will not make them my political beliefs in terms of the strategy I use. Biden went right past that on a very crucial issue, and it was one that I don't think the press ever figured out how to handle it. when we talk about tensions with bishops and tensions with this or tensions with Rome, Biden actually performed same-sex marriage rites in the White House. It might have been while he was vice president, but I'm trying to remember if there was another one while he was president. I think it was while he was vice president. He performed same-sex marriage rites, which meant he didn't just say, I'm personally opposed, but I'm going to publicly act on this as a legislative matter. Biden performed marriage rites, secular ones, of course. He couldn't do a mass, but he performed same-sex marriage rites, and he said he thought his church was wrong on that issue and needed to evolve its teachings more on homosexuality and same-sex marriage. So, once again, with this new prime minister, what could he or would he be willing to do where his own statement of belief would turn, like Biden's, from mere words into actual behavior and actions? Maybe same-sex marriage would come up there, but I don't think so in a British context. They've got lots of options for Anglican rights and whatever. But once again, the big idea here I'm trying to get to is that we're dealing with a man who is past the gold standard of Mario Cuomo and the American Catholics in politics since 1984 on up through recent decades. This guy, I think, is not going to take a stand, even of personal belief, supporting the Catholic Church on any kind of moral or social issue. But he's going to play the card over and over and over. Look how strongly I believe in Catholic social teaching on issues of poverty, immigration, health care, etc., etc. So that statement he made that you and I talked about really early in this talk, when he said, I decided the political stance that fit my Catholics the best was the Labor Party. We may hear him pull that out and wave that flag quite often.
Terry Mattingly is Senior Fellow on Communications and Culture at St. Constantine College in Houston, Texas. He writes Rational Sheep, a Substack newsletter on faith, family, and mass media. He's author of the National On Religion column for the Andrews McMeel Universal Syndicate, and for 2 decades he led the GetReligion.org website. Terry, thanks.
Glad to be here.
When we come back, Peter Northcott of National Right to Life joins us. We'll talk about abortion ballot initiatives in Idaho, Virginia, Nevada, and Missouri. What do Jesus and Paul teach about marriage, divorce, unchastity, and desertion? The Issues Etc. book of the month for July is Divorce and Remarriage, Ecclesiastical Discernment and Pastoral Care. This new resource is published by Concordia Publishing House. Their phone number, 1-800-325-3040. You can learn more about divorce and remarriage at issuesetc.org. Divorce and Remarriage by Dr. Ben Mays. The Issues Etc. book of the month for July.
Have you ever wanted to enter a program that teaches right habits and intellectual rigor as you apprehend the beautiful, the good, and the holy, all the while learning classical languages and reading classical texts? Do you want to be a classical scholar? I'm Dr. Charles Schultz, the new leader of the Classical Lutheran Education program at Concordia, Chicago. Learn more about this program at CUC by visiting cuchicago.edu, cuchicago.edu.
The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod's Life Ministry cares for pregnant women sharing the love of Christ. Listen to Pastor Ed DeWitt with Redeeming Life Outreach Ministries.
One of the first residents we had said to me, Pastor, why do you do this? And I said, just stick with me through this class, and when we're done, you'll understand completely. Many of the women, as they go through the instruction, when we get to that part about baptism, they're like, Pastor, I want that for my baby. I want my baby to be adopted into God's family.
God's Mission Here, lcms.org/national mission.
Your church service, sanctuary, and congregation are all unique, so why settle for low-quality recordings when your organist is unavailable? The Substitute Organist service from Church Music Solutions is genuine organ leadership using your instrument with your specific selections when you need it. Log on to churchmusicsolutions.com and request a free demo kit to allow you and your members to use the Substitute Organist service without obligation and without a sales pitch. Keep singing with Church Music Solutions.
Essential exercise for the Christian mind. You're listening to Issues, Etc.
At the center of our campus is Kramer Chapel, and there's a reason for that.
Issues, Etc. guest Dr. Arthur Just.
Because it is the heartbeat of Concordia Theological Seminary. It is where we go to hear the voice of Jesus and frequently be fed with the body and blood of Christ. We sometimes call it our Jerusalem. Kramer Chapel points to the classroom, which we sometimes call Athens. It is there that we do theology, biblical studies, systematic theology, practical theology, history. We love theology here, and we love the study of it, and we love coming together in worship. It's one of the things that gives us great joy. Joy in worshiping, joy in studying theology. Concordia Theological Seminary is all about the joy of being in Jesus.
Concordia Theological Seminary, Fort Wayne, Indiana, ctsfw.edu.